They want us to argue about whether she drove too fast. They want you to debate if she was a threat. They want you fighting over the shape of the bullet holes and how many seconds it took to fire the shots. But the truth, the bloody, glaring truth, is this. A 37-year-old mother of three, a poet, a neighbor, a human being, was executed on a neighborhood street by a federal agent while the nation's leaders rushed to defend her killer and rewrite reality. If the only question we ask is, was it legally justified? Then we've already lost. In this episode, we're going to talk about why this happened, who is responsible, and what it says about our government, our media, and our politics. You are listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, the podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your host. In this, the first episode of 2026, I'm going to try and hit on some of the things that went on during the short break that the podcast took. Most importantly, the murder of Renee Nicole Good. I realize by now that everyone has seen and heard massive amounts of information. Some based in reality, some obviously not, about the minute details of her death. I'm not going to spend time talking to you about the minutiae. Instead, I want to discuss the bigger picture, if you will, that has been painted by the circumstances of her death and its aftermath. But before we dive into that, let's look at some hot topics. Let's start with something we keep hearing from the top of the Republican Party, especially from President Trump and his closest minions, about why the United States invaded Venezuela. According to Trump's public statements, this was about law enforcement. He claimed that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his government were deeply involved in narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, enough so that the U.S. forces were justified in launching a military operation to capture him and bring him to face U.S. justice. Trump and his spokespeople have framed it as an extension of the war on drugs, suggesting that Maduro has been trafficking cocaine and other illegal substances into the U.S., inflicting harm on American communities. Vice President J.D. Vance echoed this narrative, saying that Maduro should not be able to avoid justice for trafficking in the United States just because he lives in a palace in Caracas. At face value, that sounds like an impressive talking point. It plays well to an American audience already exhausted by the overdoses and frustrated by drug-related crime. It evokes righteous anger. A foreign despot allegedly poisoning your kids with cocaine. And that's a story that gets attention, and that's exactly why the administration leans into it. But if you take a moment to look closely at the evidence and the expert analysis, the whole thing starts to smell a little bit. It starts to smell like political spin, and maybe something even more self-serving than that. Because here is the crucial thing. Venezuela is not actually one of the world's major sources of illegal drugs in the ways Trump has claimed. And experts say the administration has offered too little to no solid evidence leaking Venezuelan government policy to a drug trafficking threat that justifies a military invasion. There's a difference between Venezuela being a transit point in the broader narcotics trade, which is true of many countries, by the way, and Venezuelan state actors orchestrating a drug empire that reaches deep into the United States with lethal consequences. That distinction matters. If a government is torturing and oppressing its people, that's awful. But it's not the same as threatening the United States with organized narco-terrorism the way Trump has described it. Now that brings us to the second and more uncomfortable question. Why the United States really invaded Venezuela? If you strip away the official spin about drugs and law enforcement, what you're left with is something more straightforward and much more historically consistent with U.S. foreign policy. Power, resources, and global positioning. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, larger than even Saudi Arabia's. For decades, control of energy resources has been central to U.S. strategy, and Venezuela's massive reserves have long been a thorn in Washington's side, especially as Venezuela pursued independence from U.S. influence and aligned more closely with adversaries like Russia and China and Iran. Trump himself hinted at this when he said, shortly after Maduro's capture, that the U.S. would, quote, run the country and put U.S. oil companies to work rebuilding Venezuelan petroleum infrastructure. That was not a throwaway comment or a misquote. It was an explicit statement of intent to exploit a country's oil wealth. This isn't about catching drug smugglers. It's about who controls the world's oil and who gets to profit from it. And make no mistake, Venezuela's oil isn't just an economic prize. In a world where energy markets and global influence are still linked, controlling Venezuela has far-reaching implications beyond its borders. So if that's the real reason, resources and power, then we have to ask the question, was invading Venezuela appropriate? The short answer is no. From a legal standpoint, international law, and the United Nations Charter, it's made clear that no country can lawfully use military force against another except in cases of self-defense or with explicit Security Council authorization. There is no credible evidence that Venezuela posed an imminent attack on the United States, nor did any UN resolution greenlight this action. That means that what the U.S. did wasn't some lawful anti-drug raid, it was a military invasion. Now, critics have been swift to point this out, both here and abroad. Leaders from Brazil, China, Russia, Cuba, and numerous other nations condemned the United States in an emergency UN Security Council session, calling the strikes a crime of aggression and a blatant violation of Venezuela's sovereignty. Even countries we might expect to be more neutral have expressed serious concerns about the legality and potential long-term destabilization caused by this attack. And here's where the hypocrisy becomes glaring. President Trump, the same man who has spent years talking tough about drug trafficking dictators and threatening military action against narco states, recently pardoned one of the largest drug traffickers in the world, Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of trafficking hundreds of tons of drugs into the United States. That's not hyperbole. That's documented. And yet when it came to a country with a sitting president accused of authoritarianism and corruption, Trump chose war as the tool of choice. The inconsistency there, it's hard to ignore. If drugs were truly the primary justification, why pardon a drug trafficker at home while launching missiles abroad? Why not use the justice system without starting a war? The contrast lays bare the truth that the official justification was always just a story, not a strategy. And this is more than just political inconsistency. It's a window into how foreign policy narratives are shaped to serve political and economic interests, and then embellished with moral language to make them more palatable to the public. The world's reaction to the invasion reflects that understanding. Some governments, especially those historically aligned with the U.S., offered muted or cautious support, not because they think it was legal, but because they want to maintain diplomatic relations. Others outright condemn the move as an overreach and a dangerous precedent. That emergency UN meeting wasn't just diplomatic theater, it was a rebuke grounded in widely accepted principles of sovereignty and international law. And here's the irony. Many of the same leaders in the U.S. who for years criticized foreign entanglements, nation building, and endless wars suddenly embraced one of the most dramatic international military operations in decades. And they did it with no congressional authorization, without a threat to national security, and with an official narrative that just does not stand up to scrutiny. That's not defense, that's unilateral projection of power. At its core, this episode exposes something fundamental about how foreign policy is crafted. It's not always about the stated reason. It's about who stands to gain, who stands to lose, and how those in power want history to remember them. When you invade a sovereign nation because it has resources you want and a leader you dislike, and then you wrap it in language about drugs and justice, that's not deterrence, that's empire dressed up as enforcement. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the direction American foreign policy is heading. Whether the U.S. will continue to act as a unilateral actor unconstrained by law or international norms, and whether the American public will accept these justifications at face value. Because at the end of the day, one supposed reason for war, however lofty, doesn't change the reality that what just happened in Venezuela was a foreign invasion executed under dubious pretenses and justified with rhetoric that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And the global backlash, including from friends and foes alike, suggests the rest of the world saw through it too. Then there's Greenland. Yes, President Trump has once again been publicly talking about acquiring Greenland, either by purchase or pressure, or, in his own words, the easy way or the hard way. His stated reasons for this idea mix national security concerns about Russia and China with broad claims about protecting freedom. Yet they lean so heavily on oversimplified rhetoric that they barely hold together under any scrutiny. And they certainly don't hold up under international law or basic diplomatic norms. On the surface, Trump frames his interest in Greenland as a matter of strategic necessity. He warns that Russia and China could gain a foothold there if the United States doesn't ensure the island stays within its sphere of influence. He has repeatedly described U.S. ownership of Greenland as an absolute necessity for national security and even for freedom throughout the world, conjuring an imagination in which the world's largest island, somehow sitting off the North American coast, is on the brink of slipping into the hands of rival powers. But let's pause for a moment and ask, why does Trump say this? And more importantly, why do observers around the world see this narrative as shallow, misleading, or outright baffling? On its face, the strategic concern about other powers in the Arctic sounds plausible. It's not unreasonable, in theory, to worry about increasing Russian or Chinese influence in the Arctic Circle as ice melts and new shipping routes open, Greenland's location is indeed strategically significant. It sits between the North Atlantic and the Arctic Oceans, near key sea lanes, and potential military and surveillance sites. This is the same reason the United States maintains a military presence in Greenland under a long-standing agreement with Denmark. And that brings us to one of the most important realities that gets overlooked in this whole conversation. The United States already has a significant military and strategic access in Greenland without owning it. Through a treaty with Denmark dating back decades, the U.S. operates bases there and cooperates closely on defense. There's no immediate gap in U.S. military capability in the Arctic that buying this island would fix. In other words, the national defense argument as justification for territorial acquisition is nonsense. And it doesn't hold water, not legally, not practically, and certainly not diplomatically. So, if Trump's stated reason for wanting Greenland, keeping it out of Russian or Chinese hands, doesn't actually require ownership, then we have to look at what's really driving the comments. And here's where things start to look less like geopolitics and more like performance. Let's be clear. Trump's fascination with Greenland is not new. He floated the idea during his first term as kind of a real estate deal, literally talking about the island as though it were a condominium he might flip for profit. That idea was widely mocked at the time as absurd. Denmark's prime minister called it an absurd discussion, and Trump infamously canceled the state visit after his proposal was rebuffed. Now, in his second term, he's doubled down and added more dramatic rhetoric about control and security, and even implied pressure or force. This isn't how major world leaders talk about sovereign territory. It's not how you advance U.S. interests with allies, and it's not how you operate on the world stage if you're grounded in any real understanding of international relations. Part of the explanation lies in what this kind of talk does domestically. It keeps attention on Trump's image as a bold leader who thinks big, who isn't afraid to shake things up, and who is always ready to push a narrative about American strength. It feeds into his political brand, an image of someone who could take bold action to protect the country, even if that action makes no legal or diplomatic sense. In other words, Trump's targeting of Greenland looks a lot less like strategy and more like rhetoric designed for political theater. But political theater has real consequences, especially when it involves actual sovereign territory and real people. So let's talk about that for a second. Greenland isn't a piece of real estate with no one living on it. It's a region with about 57,000 people governed by its own local government and tied to Denmark in a constitutional relationship. And here's something else that gets lost in these discussions. When these discussions happen in Washington anyway, Greenlanders have repeatedly made it clear they do not want to become Americans. They don't want Greenland to be sold off like a trinket. They want control over their own future, and many of them are pursuing, or at least seriously considering, full independence from Denmark. When the leaders of Greenland's political parties came out with a unified statement saying, "We do not want to be Americans, we want to be Greenlanders," that wasn't some fringe viewpoint. It was a collective assertion of self-determination, a rejection of foreign pressures, and a rebuke to Trump's message. And it's not just Greenlandic leaders either. Denmark, a longtime NATO ally of the United States, has responded forcefully to Trump's remarks. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and her government have repeatedly emphasized that Greenland is not for sale, and that any attempt to pressure or coerce Denmark or Greenland into such arrangements is unacceptable. Some Danish officials have warned that threatening or attempting to seize Greenland could damage NATO itself, the very alliance both countries are a part of. So let's be blunt about the optics here. A U.S. president is publicly suggesting taking territory from a small, autonomous region of an allied country. And the reaction from the region is nearly universally negative. The governing parties of Greenland reject the idea. The Danish government calls it absurd. European leaders have rallied to support Denmark and Greenland. And the world outside the United States sees this not as strategic brilliance, but as diplomatic clumsiness at its best. At its worst, it's a troubling sign of how far the U.S. is willing to bend norms when it suits its own leaders' whims. When other countries mock or push back against these comments, they're not just being defensive. They're pointing out something that anyone with an ounce of diplomatic sense already knows. You don't seize or dictate terms for the territory of another sovereign people. You respect treaties. You respect alliances. And you respect the right of those people to determine their own future. Which brings us to another point. Trump's Greenland rhetoric doesn't just look out of step with the diplomatic norms. It underscores something deeper about his approach to power and governance. It reflects a desire for unchecked influence, as though global relationships are something to be taken rather than negotiated. And this from the guy who wrote Art of the Deal. It's the same tone we see when he talks about owning territory, taking back historic sites, or asserting dominance on world stages without engaging in the hard work of diplomacy. The result is a pattern where force or ownership are always on the table, even when they are legally and ethically inappropriate. That's not how international partnerships are built. That's how empires talk, not alliances. And that's what makes Trump's Greenland comments so remarkable. They aren't just misguided. They're a snapshot of a worldview that sees alliances as acquisitions, negotiations as ultimatums, and the sovereignty of other nations as negotiable. When you combine that with a willingness to downplay the perspectives and the desires of the people who actually live on this piece of land, it ends up looking less like strategic leadership and more like diplomatic hubris. So if we step back and try to understand what's really going on here, the picture becomes clearer. Trump says he wants Greenland for national security, but what he really wants is the appearance of control. A dramatic assertion of power that fits his larger political narrative, and let's be honest, distracts from other negative things, even if the underlying facts don't support it, and even if the people most affected by it reject it outright. That's not strength, that's spectacle. And while spectacle can sometimes grab headlines, it's a terrible foundation for foreign policy. Because in the real world, the one outside of presidential Truth Social posts, international relations are built on law, respect, mutual interest, and the acknowledgement that nations and peoples have agency over their own destinies. And that's exactly what Trump's Greenland comments ignore. For many months now, since the passage of the big, beautiful bill, there have been millions of Americans who have been dreading the coming of the new year, if for no other reason because the subsidies for their Obamacare premiums were going to be cut off by the new bill, leaving them with insurance premiums that either broke their bank or having to literally drop their insurance altogether. So recently, There was another fight over health care in Washington, and specifically, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill to extend the Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies. These were allowed to expire at the end of 2025 under the bill. On January 8th, the House voted 230 to 196 to pass legislation that would extend these premium tax credits for 3 more years, with 17 Republicans breaking ranks and joining all the Democrats in support. That vote did not happen smoothly. House Republican leadership, including Speaker Mikey Johnson, had spent months resisting any simple extension of the subsidies, insisting instead that healthcare solutions had to include major changes or alternatives to the Affordable Care Act. Now, of course, the GOP as a whole, including Trump, have offered nothing in the way of ideas on what those changes or alternatives could possibly be. As a matter of fact, Trump has been promising a replacement for Obamacare since way back in 2016, floating nebulous timeline after nebulous timeline for the release of some revolutionary plan that never, ever materializes. So what it took was a discharge petition, a rarely used procedural tool initiated by a small group of lawmakers to force the issue onto the floor. 15 or 17 Republicans ultimately chose to side with Democrats rather than stick with their own leadership. So what happens next? This bill now heads to the Senate, where its future is anything but certain. There have been negotiations over alternate proposals, including shorter extensions, income caps, and other changes. But there hasn't been a firm agreement yet. Some senators have previously blocked a similar extension, saying it lacked offsets or reforms they wanted, leaving millions of people poised to see premiums jump if nothing passes. Once the Senate acts, or doesn't, any final version would still need the president's signature before it becomes law. And all of this has to happen fast because people need health coverage and sign-up deadlines are looming. So let's talk a little bit about why this matters in the real world for anybody who has this facet of it has escaped them. These aren't abstract numbers on a ledger. This bill would affect tens of millions of people, both Democrat and Republican and otherwise. The enhanced subsidies were created during the pandemic and continued through 2025 to make health insurance premiums more affordable for people buying coverage through the ACA marketplace. They have more than doubled the enrollment in the ACA, with some 22 million Americans currently relying on them to keep coverage affordable. If those subsidies expired, premiums in many states would begin to skyrocket, in some cases more than doubling, because the financial assistance that capped the costs for low and middle income enrollees simply goes away. Without extension, families paying hundreds of dollars less per month in premiums could see their costs jump by thousands of dollars a year. For average Americans, especially those without employer-based insurance, or those in states that didn't expand Medicaid, that's not just math. That's the difference between having health care and going without it. Imagine a household where a chronic illness or surprise medical emergency can already wipe out savings. Suddenly being hit with a 100% or more increase in premiums, purely because Congress let the subsidies expire, it's not an abstract policy debate. It's a real-world financial heartbreak for millions of people. That's why this vote wasn't just another step in congressional theater. It was a recognition that letting these subsidies lapse would harm millions of people. And it's also why we saw Republican lawmakers from swing districts break with their party's leadership, because they know some of their own constituents would be directly hurt by expired subsidies and higher premiums. So, if it's important to everyday Americans, why did so many Republicans spend so long fighting the extension? That brings us to one of the more frustrating and bizarre elements of this story, the role played by partisan politics, and in particular by President Trump's long-standing gripe with anything tied to President Obama's legacy. Make no mistake, Trump personally has never liked the Affordable Care Act. He campaigned for years on repealing Obamacare, and during his first term as president, he repeatedly tried, over and over, and failed to fully dismantle it. Throughout, he and many of his party used the law as a political punching bag, a symbol of government overreach, waste, and inefficiency. That political posture didn't change just because the subsidies were now benefiting real people struggling with rising healthcare costs. In Trump's view, acknowledging the benefits of these subsidies is like admitting that Obama did something right. And anything that smells like acknowledging a successful move on Obama's part seems to send Trump into something resembling a rage spiral. Because to him, political victories, especially long-lasting political policy ones like ACA coverage, are trophies that must be denied or diminished at all costs. That's not governing. That's grudge-bearing with a megaphone. Trump himself didn't publicly endorse a straight extension. Instead, he urged House Republicans to come up with some new plan, including ideas like putting money into health savings accounts instead of paying subsidies directly to insurers. But here's the part that's wild if you stop and think about it for a second. Republicans didn't even have any workable alternative for weeks. All they had were concepts, vague slogans, and political posturing. While average people faced real premium increases looming just over the horizon. This is where the connection between Trump's personal vendetta and policy paralysis becomes more than just an anecdote. It's not just that Republicans disagree with the Affordable Care Act on principle. That's a fair political debate. It's that Trump's fixation on denying anything that might look like an Obama victory became a partisan blocker to any practical solution. Instead of saying, millions of Americans are hurting, let's work together, the messaging, from the top, was something closer to, we can't do anything that looks like a win for Obamacare, even if it helps people pay their bills. And let's remember, this isn't some tiny, tidy slice of population. These subsidies help families across the country, including in deep red states, where enrollment numbers have increased dramatically. In fact, many of the people who would be hit hardest by letting them expire live in states that voted for Trump. Places like Texas and Mississippi and Georgia. Yet, party leadership and the White House were content to let costs rise to punish their constituents rather than simply extend the existing system. That's not just stubbornness, that's political pride implicated by policy failure. Even some Republicans acknowledge privately that letting the subsidies lapse would be politically unwise, especially with midterm elections on the horizon and healthcare remaining a top concern for voters. But for months, the party's official posture was to resist extension, not because they had a better tested alternative, but because taking action on a policy associated with Obama felt like too much to swallow. That's not governing. That's grinning through your fingers while you watch ordinary people suffer. Make no mistake, this split within the GOP reflects a broader tension. On one side are lawmakers who see healthcare as a practical policy issue, affecting their constituents' wallets and well-being. On the other, there are leaders more concerned with ideological purity and symbolic victories. And right in the middle are millions of Americans who just want to be able to go to the doctor without going broke. As the bill now moves to the Senate, the stakes remain high. Senate negotiations could still change the duration of the extension or add income limits or other tweaks. But regardless of the form, the fact that the House had to force a vote that a significant number of Republicans rejected their own leadership to support, and that millions of people face higher premiums if nothing passes, that should tell you everything you need to know about where American politics is right now. We live in a country where a policy that helps 22 million Americans was held up for political optics, where acknowledging any part of Obama's legacy is treated like heresy, and where the leadership of a major party would rather negotiate with itself than simply do what's necessary for the people that they're supposed to represent. If that's not a sign of dysfunction, I don't know what is. And that brings us to our main topic for this episode. Let's start with the most obvious and the most infuriating aspect of all of this. The federal government, the very entity supposed to protect the rights and lives of its citizens, now deploys an armed paramilitary force inside our cities that operates with less transparency, less accountability, and less legal restraint than any local or state police department. In Minneapolis last week, that force was immigration and customs enforcement, and the victim was not an anonymous figure in a crime story. She was Renee Nicole Good, a 37-year-old U.S. citizen, a wife, a mother of three, a poet, a human being. She was in her vehicle. She was trying to drive away. And she was shot dead by an ICE agent who had no warrant, offered no credentials, and operating under a set of extremely vague and increasingly militarized internal protocols. You want to know what changed? Not long ago, just a handful of years, ICE agents looked like what they were supposed to be, investigators with windbreakers and clipboards. Today, they roll through American neighborhoods in tactical gear, masked, armed to the teeth, and in unmarked vehicles. Often they're personal vehicles, and they frequently announce nothing to the people they approach. They don't show warrants. They don't announce their presence as law enforcement. They approach citizens like combatants in a war zone, and they treat civilians like hostile suspects. This is not speculation. This is not hyperbole. This is policy evolution. And it didn't happen by accident. It happened because politicians and law enforcement leaders enabled it. So let's get this clear right up front. What happened to Renee Good wasn't an isolated blunder or an unfortunate accident. It's the inevitable consequence of empowering federal agents with battlefield gear, zero meaningful oversight, poor training and poor vetting, and an institutional culture that protects them before it ever investigates them. We have to talk about the official narrative because it matters, of course. Right after the shooting, the Department of Homeland Security and its political defenders, including Vice President J.D. Vance and Homeland Security Kristi Noem, rushed to defend the shooter, characterized Good as a threat, and even claimed she was part of some radical or paid network trying to incite violence. Noem said Good had been stalking and impeding ICE all day, portraying her as some kind of domestic terrorist. Vance echoed similar defenses, blaming far-left rhetoric for encouraging attacks on law enforcement. Trump, of course, jumped in, repeating baseless claims that Good was part of a left-wing network of agitators. He even added, in complete contradiction to the visual evidence, that the ICE agent was run over and that he, Trump, was shocked that the agent even survived. But let's pause for a second and think about that. Think about what it means when the person in the White House and his second in command can not only instantly decide a U.S. citizen is guilty of being a paid provocateur without presenting a shred of evidence. They don't need to wait for ballistic reports. They don't need to hear witness statements or see forensic timelines. They look at a video, the same video everyone else sees, and yet they describe it in a way that directly contradicts what is on the screen. I'm not going to parse this. They are lying. They are not telling the truth, and they are doing it knowingly. They are knowingly uttering things that they know to be false because they believe confidently that the folks who support them will believe anything that comes out of their mouths. That's not governing. That's certainly not reporting. That's propaganda. Nothing more and nothing less. And what's worse, once the administration aired that propaganda, whole swaths of MAGA media and political commentators just ran with it, even when it directly contradicted common sense and direct visual evidence. Fox pundits, conservative talk hosts, and the social media ignoramuses, both real ones and the bots, immediately pivoted to repeating the administration's nonsense narrative. She was a threat. The agent was justified. Don't believe what your own eyes show you. Here is the core truth. At that point, the administration had no intention of speaking factually. They had no desire to collect information or evidence. The administration didn't moderate their language at all. They escalated the situation. And the immediate effect was to shape public perception before any real investigation could happen. Instead of saying something like, "We're gathering facts and we'll report them," they said, "This was self-defense and Good was the aggressor." That's not caution. That's control. Oh, and when it was reported that she was married to a woman, oh, well, at that point, the salivating troglodytes were practically orgasmic. Not only was she then a hired agent, but she was an aggressor with an LGBTQ plus agenda. The magosphere became almost euphoric in their "see, we told you" commenting, ignoring the fact that it had absolutely zero to do with the tragedy. Well, unless, of course, it happened to be the motivating factor for the agent. See, the woman's wife was there as well. So, I suppose if the right can claim that the victim's sexual preference can make her guilty, then it's okay for the other side to presume that that preference might have influenced the agent's quick-draw response, right? At some point, someone needs to explain to MAGA that bullshit cuts both ways. Before I go any farther, I want to mention again the paid agitators line. It's like the political version of blaming ghosts for the noise in your attic. Whenever there's a protest that makes people on the right uncomfortable, someone inevitably pops up to insist it all must be fake and manufactured or funded by some shadowy cabal cutting Soros-sized checks to random folks with signs. And yet, decade after decade, no one ever seems to produce any receipts. No payroll, no bank transfers, no verified organizers handing out Venmo links for riot duty. Just vibes and rumors and a whole lot of projection. The idea sticks not because it's true, because it ain't, but because it's useful. It allows leaders and their followers to dismiss real, organic anger or disagreement without actually having to grapple with why so many people are upset in the first place. What's really happening is much simpler and much more uncomfortable. People show up because they're angry or scared or fed up. They don't need to be paid. They don't need to be paid to be outraged when they see someone killed or mistreated or dehumanized. The paid agitator myth turns genuine grief and fury into a conspiracy theory, stripping protesters of their humanity and turning them into props in a political fantasy. It's a way of saying these aren't real people with real feelings. They're just actors in a plot against us. And if this reminds you of how the right claims that mass shootings are often filled with paid actors, you're not the only one who makes that connection in their head. But once you buy that horseshit, and make no mistake, it's utter, unsubstantiated nonsense, it becomes much easier to justify ignoring the protesters, or worse, hating them. Now, let's talk about the investigation a little bit, or rather, the absence of one. Local authorities in Minnesota, including the city's mayor and attorneys general, asked for transparency and a joint investigation. They wanted access to videos and witness statements and forensic evidence, but the Department of Justice, under the Trump administration, shut them out. Supposedly, the FBI is now handling the case exclusively, with no real oversight from state or local law. But it was also announced that the government's civil rights attorney for the DOJ will not be investigating the shooting at all. Think about that for a minute. A federal agency kills a U.S. citizen on a public street. Then, the federal government removes all local oversight from the investigation. That would be shocking in any context. But it's downright terrifying in a country that still claims to uphold justice and rule of law. This should raise alarm bells for everyone, especially those who have historically claimed to care about government overreach or intrusion. Because what we're watching isn't just a lack of accountability, it's an effort to control the narrative, shield the shooter, and suppress any scrutiny that doesn't align with the administration's political needs. Now let's address something even more dissonant, the loyalty dynamic on the political right. For years, many conservative voices, particularly those aligned with the MAGA movement, have seized every opportunity to rail against big government intrusion, federal overreach, and tyranny when it comes from Washington. They flew Gadsden flags. They railed against the Patriot Act. They justified hoarding guns as necessary for when the government comes. They howled about the FBI or the CDC or OSHA telling them what they should do. They claimed to valorize personal freedom and were skeptical of any centralized authority. What happened? The moment a federal agent executed a U.S. citizen in broad daylight, many of those same voices, most of those same voices, didn't pause for a moment to ask questions. They didn't demand an independent investigation. They didn't demand transparency and accountability. They defended the government's narrative without evidence. They looked at the same footage and said, "Trust Trump." That, ladies and gentlemen, is cognitive dissonance. That's not skepticism. That's submission to power when the power looks like someone you politically agree with. What does that tell us about the current state of political allegiance in America? It tells us that for many people, the principle of questioning authority isn't actually a principle at all. It's a partisan preference. You oppose the feds only when your team isn't running them. The moment your team controls the narrative, authority becomes sacrosanct. And make no mistake, that is what's happening here. Now let's step back for a second here and talk about the broader implications. What happened to Renee Good is more than tragic. It's a symptom of a handful of things. First of all, militarized federal law enforcement with minimal accountability. Politicized justice systems that shield agents from scrutiny. Executive power so centralized that it can override law enforcement and public transparency. A media environment where political loyalty beats observable reality. And 5, a political faction eager to defend its leaders before basic facts are even established. This isn't just about ICE. It's about the way power operates in Trump 2.0. And let's not forget this. The video footage itself, from multiple angles, contradicts the official claims of self-defense. Independent analyses and eyewitness accounts show that Good was attempting to drive away, not veering at agents like a weapon. Many people on social media, ordinary citizens watching minute by minute, have dissected the footage frame by frame, and what emerges is a situation that does not justify lethal force. Yet, the federal narrative persists. Why? Because controlling the story matters so much more than the truth. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a government that is increasingly comfortable with using force against its own citizens, issuing narratives that contradict observable reality, and demanding that the public trust them before transparency or accountability of any kind are provided. And it leaves us with a political movement that claims to oppose government overreach until the government doing the overreaching is their government. And that should alarm everyone, regardless of party. Before I wind this up, I want you to ask yourself this. What does it mean when politicians rush to defend a federal killer before any investigation is done? What does it mean when their supporters echo those defenses without demanding evidence? What does it say about our political culture when seeing with your own eyes can be dismissed as biased or misinformation? This is not a one-off. This is not a freak event. This is the logical endpoint of years of empowering federal agencies, militarizing enforcement, and eroding accountability. Renee Good's name deserves more than just another headline. Her life and her death forces us to confront not just what happened that day in Minneapolis, but what kind of country are we becoming? And if we can't do that honestly, then nothing else we say about justice matters. Okay, so at the risk of giving everyone whiplash by changing the tone and the topic so abruptly, I want to end this episode on a high note. Over the past year, something unexpected has been happening in the landscape of American public opinion. Not a seismic shift, but a noticeable adjustment in the collective thermostat of the country's political attitudes. As the current administration has pursued aggressive tariffs and sweeping deportation policies and a foreign policy streak that's been, dangerous to long-standing alliances, recent polling data suggests that many Americans are pushing back, not just in opposition to specific policies, but in reaffirmation of core democratic values that have defined the United States since its inception. Let's unpack this, because what's remarkable isn't just that people are unhappy with particular policies, but that they're rediscovering support for ideas that have traditionally been associated with openness and cooperation and pluralism. In other words, people aren't just rejecting the latest headlines. They're returning to principles that have historically made this country resilient and prosperous. We'll start with trade. For much of the 20th century, the American economy flourished under a relatively open trade regime. Trade agreements didn't just lower tariffs, they expanded markets, created jobs in export industries, and helped keep prices lower for consumers. But, lately the administration has championed a different tack, a protectionist stance that has pushed tariff levels to levels not seen since the 1930s, with an average effective tariff rate of about 18% on some goods, according to economists. Those policies were supposed to promote domestic production and economic strength, but the public reaction has been, politely put, chilly. Polling data shows that Americans are significantly more supportive of trade as an economic opportunity now than they were just a couple of years ago, rising from around 61% to a striking 81% overall in favor of trade as a positive force for the economy. Even Republicans, long stereotyped as skeptical of open markets, have shifted dramatically on this issue, with support jumping from roughly 43% to 78%. That's not a slight nudge. That's a cultural pivot. It suggests that when trade starts to look like a battering ram on people's wallets, higher prices at the grocery store, disrupted supply chains, the American public says, no thanks, we prefer economic engagement to economic isolation. It's also showing up in attitudes on immigration, believe it or not. The portrayal of immigration in national politics over the last several years has often leaned into fear and division, debates over borders, enforcement tactics that, have dominated media coverage. Let's just put it that way. But if you look at recent Gallup polling, you'll see a huge swing in how people think about immigration. The share of Americans who think immigration is good for the country has climbed all the way up to 79%, a record high, up from around 64% last year. In 2024. And simultaneously, the percentage of Americans who want immigration reduced has dropped from 55% to about 30%. Quite a dramatic turnaround. And that's not small noise in the data. That's a rejection of the idea that America should become more insular or closed off. A default affirmation of the value immigrants bring to the economy and the culture and society as a whole. And here's the kicker. This shift isn't limited to one ideological corner of the country. While partisans still differ in intensity on immigration, the trend across the spectrum is unmistakable. People are recalibrating their instincts towards openness, not fear. This already visible return to more traditional American values is also cropping up in people's views on foreign policy and alliances. Support for arming Ukraine, a proxy in many ways for upholding international norms against aggression, is now above 60% nationwide, up significantly from prior years. And that's not insignificant. It shows that most Americans aren't buying the notion that the United States should withdraw from its global commitments and alliances simply because the rhetoric in Washington has suddenly become isolationist. When you add all this up, trade and immigration and international cooperation, you get a picture of a public that's pushing back against extremes and toward the core values that have long undergirded American democracy. There's a term for this kind of response: thermostatic public opinion. Essentially, what it says is that if policymakers push the country too far in one direction, the public reacts by swinging back toward the middle, as if the national mood has a built-in sort of regulatory function. That's exactly what we're starting to see now, as appeals to protectionism and isolationism and harsh enforcement have grown stronger from the top. The public's appetite for openness and cooperation has grown stronger from the bottom. Now, let's be clear. This doesn't mean Americans suddenly embrace every element of globalism without question. But it does mean that when the rhetoric and the policies start to look like they're tearing at the social fabric, when people see tariffs hiking up their grocery bills, they see deportation raids splashing across their screens, and diplomatic squabbles straining relationships with our allies, the public tends to recalibrate towards pragmatism and principle. That recalibration looks to many analysts like a collective reaffirmation of democratic values, belief in free markets, fair immigration systems, international partnerships that reinforce rather than isolate the United States. And here's the really uplifting part. This shift isn't happening only on the left. As with trade, broad swaths of moderate and even more traditionally conservative voters are moving back towards views that embrace cooperation with allies, sensible immigration policies, and economic openness in general. That's not just politics. That's Americans remembering at a gut level what has historically worked for their families and communities. Make no mistake, though, this tempered backlash isn't happening in a vacuum. The change in public sentiment has been fueled by real consequences that many Americans are now feeling and seeing in their day-to-day lives. The cost of goods has climbed in response to tariff pressures. Farmers, once champions of protectionist policies, have found themselves needing federal bailouts because trade partners retaliated. Families and small business owners alike are seeing costs inch up at the checkout line for groceries and needed supplies. When policy choices hit the wallet, people start paying attention, and they start comparing them not just to politics, but to practical outcomes. Similarly, the aggressive approach to immigration enforcement, from stepped-up deportations to militarized raids and as of late, deaths, has sparked widespread public unease. Stories of mixed immigration status families being torn apart, or people who have lived in the United States legally for years being targeted, these have stirred public concern. That unease shows up in polls that indicate many Americans believe immigration enforcement has gone too far. That the tactics being used are out of step with American values of fairness and due process. And on foreign policy, frustrations with the handling of ongoing conflicts have also helped shape people's opinions. While a minority still favors withdrawing from all global engagements, a clear majority supports maintaining alliances like NATO and providing security assistance, seeing these not as just wasteful handouts, but as investments that afford mutual stability and democratic resilience. The whole dynamic isn't some accidental byproduct of public whim. It's the essence of democratic engagement. When people feel that the government's direction pushes too far from their lived reality and their core beliefs about how the world should work, they shift. They push back. They say, in effect, we value free markets. We value open communities. We value alliances that uphold peace and stability. That's not mere contrarianism. That's the public affirming the democratic principles that have, for all their messiness, given the United States its resilience and strength through the years. And that, in a weirdly hopeful twist, brings us to a reminder that in a democracy, the public's voice really does matter. Or at least it should. When the policies of a presidency, regardless of party, veer too far from what the majority of Americans feel protects their economic interests and their ethical values, you see that thermostat effect kick in. When people collectively rediscover that they want fairness and opportunity and openness and trusted international partnerships, you see it show up in the polls. So yes, it's easy to focus on the noises, the tweets, the announcements, the political theater. But underneath all that, there's something more fundamental happening, a broad reassessment among Americans about what they actually want their country to be and how they actually want it to engage with the world. That's not just reactionary politics. That's a reminder, writ large, that democratic values have a life of their own. And when pushed too hard in one direction, the American people have a way of rediscovering their own center. Okay, that concludes another episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. As always, my sincere thanks for taking the time to download and listen to the podcast. I'd love to hear from you. I love to have comments from people, whether they agree or disagree, whether they compliment or criticize. It doesn't matter to me. I want to hear what you're thinking. You can reach out to the podcast by using any of the social media platforms that the podcast uses. They are all available on the Linktree page, and the Linktree page is in the episode description. I'll be back on Friday with the year's first supplemental Back Porch Files. So until then, stay engaged, stay kind, and as always, have the kind of week you'd wish for others.